Or maybe we should start. I see we have 40 participants. That's a pretty good number. Oh, Don has given up on us already. So thanks, Chiara. As Chiara mentioned, I'm Luis with the Bretton Woods Project, a London-based organization that works as a watchdog, particularly in the World Bank and the IMF. So thank you very much, Chiara, for inviting me to the event and for asking me to chair. I'm going to try to provide some kind of a context for the discussion, which is not particularly easy given the scope of it. But I suppose one could begin by placing the today's discussion within the context of the some would argue long gone structural adjustment programs of the yesteryears, the 80s and 90s, and their legacy. As I suppose one could begin even before that with the conditions imposed by colonies on the colonials and their colonies, but I guess we won't start there. And then you see that before the great financial crisis of 2008, there was much talk about the death, or at least the dramatically decreased influence of the World Bank and the IMF, as those would recall. But then the financial crisis of 2008 came along, and as evidenced a rebirth or a rise in importance once again of both the bank and the fund, and actually of other DFIs, development finance institutions. Alongside that, however, you do have, which I find quite interesting, the establishment of the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which many have argued, I think with good reason, that their establishment was as a counter to what many countries in the global south have really long considered the geopolitically and ideologic biased policy conditions required of development finance institutions, including the bank and the fund. So you have two countervening dynamics, I think, the increased importance of the bank and the fund and others, but also this effort by the global south to at least begin to counter the hegemony of the North in the international architecture. But of course, the bank and the fund, as we know, they're very adaptable and they always evolve, at least superficially. I recall, for example, Lagarde, the former IMF director's Lagarde, when she responded to a question about the continued use of structural adjustment programs, saying, well, we're no longer your grandfather's IMF, i.e. they don't do conditionalities or structural adjustment programs anymore. And you also see the changes in, for example, the bank's renewed focus on borrower ownership, and the idea that they tout that their country partnership frameworks, which provide the framework for their in-country programming, that those are jointly developed with the borrowers. So there's much more of an emphasis on this joint development of IMF and World Bank programs. And obviously, as the blurb in advance of this event articulates, the pandemic has really brought, once again, the DFIs to the fore, and in particular, the development policy financing of the World Bank, which is one of the key vehicles that's been used for bank lending in response to the pandemic. So, and it's interesting to note, apropos of this idea that these programs are jointly developed and agreed, that states in the aftermath of the pandemic or continued response to the pandemic really find themselves in a particularly weak bargaining position to counter lending conditionalities, right? And while the bank, on the other hand, and the fund insist that these programs are jointly agreed and therefore consensual, which begs the question why, for example, conditions are contracted conditions are necessary if that were truly the case. But I suppose we'll discuss that throughout the event. Simultaneously, it's interesting, I think, to note that decades of neoliberal anti-state discourse has really led to, at least to some degree, to an internalization of the inefficient, corrupt state narrative. And so many people within the global south, and for example, I'm from Brazil, and I would say that there are good reasons to be skeptical of my current government. However, there is this idea that we have to consider that these discussions are taking place in a situation in which the state, there's much more suspicion of the state than was the case in, earlier on in the 80s, 70s, 80s, etc., where the developmental state had much more purchase, I would argue, in some corners. I'll give you an example. For example, I participate in the a civil society policy forum working group within the World Bank, where we review the applications for these seminars that are held at the sidelines of the World Bank spring and annual and IMF spring and annual meetings. And the number of panel requests that deal with governance failures of states and the need for the bank and the fund to step in and ensure that the money is adequately spent and, you know, fiscally prudent approaches are undertaken. It's quite stunning, I think. So I think we need to take seriously that those things, I'm not saying they're not without merit at all, but I think there is also this issue of internalization of these approaches. And then, or this narrative rather. Additionally, you know, one of the things that has developed is this idea of the dynamic between the human rights and climate change community, and the generation of this debate of whether or not we can develop a framework for positive or green conditionalities. You know, so to what extent are external pressures necessary to guide government behavior in a way that they're, you know, supportive of human rights and the fight to avoid catastrophic climate change. So, you know, to me, these issues seem to bring to the fore one of the very interesting and often ignored discussions about how to deal with the tensions of a multilateral system based on nation states and these other, you know, potentially conflicting dynamics of local needs and voices that go unheard or are marginalized at the state level. All that said, you know, and looking at it more as a systems approach or the mechanics of the issues that we'll discuss today, we see the ongoing World Bank development policy finance retrospective. I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to look at the summary, but it really is clear that it takes its point of departure, the inherent superiority of the private sector-led development model, which is also can be seen in the recently announced revival of the Doing Business report. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but the bank in September announced that it was doing away with the Doing Business report and the rankings, but it appears that they have rethought that and they will reinstitute the Doing Business report in a couple of years' time. And you also have the green, resilient, inclusive recovery by the World Bank, which is also very much in line with this idea of the private sector-led development, which is, I mentioned all that's obviously because most of the policy conditions are used to embed that kind of approach within the national economic management frameworks. So we must also, I think, take seriously the proposition by the bank and the fund that many governments are indeed supportive of the conditions to which they agree. I mentioned this partially because I think the process of internalization of these ideas of the private sector-led development approach, the corrupt state, and, you know, the erosion of the narrative of the development state have been adopted by many government and state leaders themselves and ministers of finance, etc. So I think that's something to think about. So in short, then, you know, given the complex dynamics and discussions about how civil society and others should respond to the conditioned use of policy conditions remains extremely important. And we hope the discussion can support us in making some progress towards reaching some, maybe consensus is a strong word, but taking some steps in forging a more joint approach. And we, you know, to help us in doing that, we have a great panel, and I'll introduce them very briefly. So we have Alex Kentekelenis, sorry, Alex, for butchering your name. He's Associate Professor of Sociology and Political Economy at Bocconi University in Milan. Prior to this, he held research posts at Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard. Alex has published extensively on two research areas: decision-making and global governance, especially in relation to health and economy, and the health effects of economic policies. He has a long curriculum, so I'll cut it short here. Don Marut, he has been working from grassroots community of national and international advocacy for more than 20 years. He was active in international dialogues on aid effectiveness, advocacy, on debt reduction, climate change, and reforms of multilateral development banks. He was the executive director of INFID, International NGO Forum on Indonesian Development, and now active with INSIST, Indonesian Society for Social Transformation, and Baileo Maluku, a community organization in Maluku Islands. Then we have Wangari Kinoti. Wangari is the interim international head of women's rights, as well as international policy advisor for women's rights at ActionAid International. Over the last 12 years, she has led global program and advocacy work on women's unpaid care and domestic work, women's access to decent work, and structural drivers of gender-based violence. And finally, last but certainly not least, you have Chiara Mariotti. And Chiara is a development economist and joined Eurodad in October 2020 as Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer on Development Finance. She leads work on the IFI's undue influence on developing countries' policies in fiscal space and on reforms of global economic governance. So that's our very strong group of panelists. And I think that's been exactly 10 minutes. So I've managed to keep myself on time, which is a good sign for a chair, I suppose. So without further ado, then I would open the floor and give it to Don Marutu for your 10 to 12 minute presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. I would like to start with the history of conditionalities and structural adjustment program, particularly in Indonesia. But first, I would like to say that when other parts of the world, developing world, in late 1970s, early 1980s to 1990s, are struggling to fight against structural adjustment program. Indonesia actually at the time take its own initiative to do the structural adjustment program. So there was no conditionality at all from the World Bank actually at the time. When that issue in early 1980s and also the oil price shock at the time that affect all countries in developing countries at the time, including Indonesia. Indonesia actually studied, the government of Indonesia studied the structural adjustment program, and then they start conducting the structural adjustment program in 1983, late 1982, early 1983, and the situation was quite unique. The director of the World Bank in Jakarta at the time met with the finance minister, and he said to the finance minister, according to my analysis, I think there must be something you have to do in the next few months to respond to the crisis, global crisis. It is maybe you have to devalue your currency in quite big amount. And then the finance minister was quite surprised, and then he said, okay, can you give me a one-page note? And then the director of the World Bank make a note. But at the time, the finance minister said to him that only you and me who knows it. Even IMF also is not allowed to be told about the situation. So then in few hours, the director of the World Bank wrote the note one-page note and gave to him the calculation. Then the calculation was that the devaluation of the currency should be between 26 to 30%. And then the finance minister discussed with the national planning minister, and then they discussed, okay, only 3 of us now who knows the situation. And then after this 2 or 3 hours, only 4 of us. It is the president. So the president, the finance minister, the national development planning minister, and the director of the World Bank. Only 4 of them knows about the situation. So then the president Suharto at the time, he decided, okay, I'll take the middle range, and it is from 26 to 30. Then he chose 28% for devaluation. So that was, and then they announced it. But then, and then the following action taken by the government at the time, this was the budget is reduced, and then the spending for social service also reduced, and it's only in 1 year. And then they start focusing on promoting industry, manufacture, and some like that. But there was no external support at all, only the discussions. The World Bank actually tried to, at the time, propose support in terms of loan to the government, but the government still didn't want to accept it. But then in the second oil shock and also the debt crisis, because Indonesia have to pay the debts that were scheduled in 1968. Then the government finally accept the loan from the World Bank in 1987. But the loan also without conditionality. So the structural adjustment program in Indonesia from 1982 until 1997, actually there was no structural adjustment at all. But then from 1997 to 2003, when ASEAN financial crisis happened, then IMF came in with heavy conditionalities to get the safety package from the IMF to Indonesia. And it totally changed the landscape of politics and economy, and not only, even also social and cultural situation in Indonesia because of this. Like, for example, decentralization was huge. Suddenly, the situation where the control of the government and finance was in the center in Jakarta, and suddenly it was distributed to about more than 100 districts, with special autonomy. It is good actually for the people, but the situation was not quite good because nobody in the government who is strong enough to control it, even at local level. So it was like anarchy at all in the government in that situation. So IMF was in the lead for pushing the government to take all the policy changes in Indonesia.
Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to give you a heads up that I noticed that you're on your first slide, and you have about 5 minutes to go. So,
okay. Yeah. So and then the third generation of this conditionality and structural adjustment for Indonesia, it was when the World Bank take the lead. So when I think in other parts of the developing world, they are in a normal situation. But in Indonesia, until now, the World Bank is still pushing conditionalities to Indonesia. I calculated from 1997 to 2000 until 2015. Yeah. From IMF, there were 1990 conditionalities in 1997 to 2003. But from the World Bank, there were 53 for development policy loans, but for sectoral, no, not sorry, let's be in the next. Okay, from the World Bank, there were 8 development policy loans with 98 detailed conditionalities. And then for sectoral adjustment loans, there are 20 sectoral adjustment loans with about 27, I think, 27 conditionalities. So what is the implication? Yeah, I quote Bob Jessop's term on denationalization and the new state formation. So with these conditionalities, the situation in Indonesia is like you don't know who takes the lead. We have sovereignty, territory is there, but who control the policies only, yeah, maybe only those who are doing the research on World Banks and policy change in Indonesia then knows that it is the World Bank actually the real government in Indonesia who make policies and at the same time in terms of sovereignty, in terms of substantive sovereignty, Indonesia actually loses its sovereignty to the World Bank. The World Bank becomes the real governing body of Indonesia, and the World Bank is also the word from Bob Jessop, yeah, is conducting, holding out the core values of Indonesia as a nation state, and is filling with the new values based on the neoliberal principles. Self-interested, individualistic, monetization, profit-oriented actions. Even politics now is like a business to make profit. There is no more politics for common good or something. We cannot imagine that politicians are working for common good of the people. It is for profit. And then the second implication is the susceptible to external economic and financial shock. One of the conditionality during IMF and then continued by the World Bank is the liberalization of capital account. So foreign direct investment is free, so they can move easily out and eat in Indonesia. So if there is a shock at global level, it affects quickly. Like in 2008 and 2009, for example, when there was an economic crisis, Indonesia was hit a lot. So, but to save the economic shock, then World Bank provide new loan. Okay. New loan with, in 2009, there was 2 billion, actually, not 2 million, but $2 billion to secure Indonesia. And in 2013, there was also $2 billion to save. So,
sorry, Don, just to give you a heads up, you have 1 minute to go.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks.
So, conditionalities, I think, yeah, only make countries as experimental puppets of the IFs, World Bank, and experimental for a never-ending formulation of new ideology, and maybe not neoliberalism. There is another ideology they are developing. And conditionality, I think it's like quote from Richard Dawkins' work. Conditionality is kind of a gene. Maybe it's a selfish gene in IFs. It is still seeking its proper place in the world, which nobody knows when it will end. But I think this selfish gene can only end its endeavor to form behavior and action only when IFs is end or is ended. thank you. It is my presentation list. Over to you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I mean, several interesting points raised. You know, I think one of the things that I found interesting about your presentation, among many, was the fact that I suppose you argue that initially Indonesia undertook some structural reform, not under conditionality, but on its own accord. So, you know, obviously we have to accept that reforms, structural reforms, are possible without the conditionalities. But you also raise this issue of what are the implications of the reforms, right? And whose benefit are they for? Whose interests do they represent? And of course, we must realize that the bank and the fund would question our analysis that they have had negative economic circumstances. You know, if you deal with the bank and the fund, they hold true to their idea that the global economy is largely on a good path, that inequality has been decreasing, you know, developments have been largely positive. So you have two very different narratives. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Chiara. Thanks, Chiara.
Sure, thanks, Luis. Let me share my presentation. Just a moment. There you are. Can you all see it? Yeah, okay. And Luis, help me with timing. I will try to stay in 10 minutes, but I will need your help.
I feel very generous, so I'll give you 12 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So what I wanted to share with you this afternoon are the key findings of a piece of work that I've done in the past months, and that focuses on the World Bank Development Policy Finance, which is the bank's instrument through which basically conditionality are more explicitly applied to countries in the form of prior actions. So development policy finance comes in the form of budget support in exchange of specific policy reforms that countries must implement. And it's an instrument that in the past few years had been raising renewed attention from civil society because its use was in the rise. And of course, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, this has become even more relevant because let's say that it's favorite instrument when it comes to responding to crisis, because it's faster to deliver. It's a faster way for the bank to deliver funds to countries. And it's also a great opportunity for an international institution like the World Bank to push on its policy blueprint on a country that needs to react to a crisis. So in the past 2 years now, this has raised quite a few concerns on civil society, and we as Eurodad decided to try to look at all the development policy operations that had been approved and funded in the post-COVID period, and see what was going on, how the bank is using overall this instrument to respond to the crisis, what kind of policies is pushing on crisis through the use of conditionality. So I'm briefly presenting this study, the findings of the study, and then sharing a few reflections on the use of conditionality in this instrument. Obviously, there is a report in which you will find all the details on the findings. So very briefly, we looked at a database with 90 projects over 64 countries for a total of about 23 billion mobilized. Most of this, sorry, there you go. No, this is the slide that I want you to see. I hope it's big enough. It shows the distribution of funds by IDA and IBRD.
Chiara, I'm still on your first slide.
You are still on the first slide.
I don't know if
Okay.
I'm the only one.
This is not good. No, you're probably not the only one. This was the second slide.
Very good.
And this is the third slide, showing distribution of development policy finance by IBRD and IDA. But I'm now bringing you to this other slide, which gives the first set of findings. So I looked at what prior actions, so what policy reforms were being implemented in these 90 PPOs in 7 policy areas. And the first policy area that I looked at was the one of fiscal advice and macroeconomic policy. And the key finding that I want to stress here is something that Luis mentioned already earlier, that is the increasing alignment between these policy reforms that prescribe institutional changes, institutional reforms that somehow lay the ground for fiscal contraction and that are increasingly aligned with prescriptions in IMF programs, and not least because, of course, the number of countries that have both IMF loans, IMF programs, as well as development policy finance projects has increased in the past two years. So there is an increasing overtake of this institution at the same time on the fiscal framework of countries. So the World Bank lays the ground for the reforms that are needed to then apply fiscal tightening. And this is visible in many countries. And something that I wanted to stress that some of you have already worked on is that often these kind of prescriptions also involve cuts in public spending and often cuts in public wage bill. And this has been the case, including during the pandemic. One country that I wanted to stress is the case of Montenegro, in which there were prior actions concerning cuts in the expenses for expensive drugs, whatever that might say. Once again, this was in 2020, so during the pandemic. The second area is the support to businesses. A lot of operations and a lot of prior actions had a focus on business and private sector support. This was to be expected. 3 trends here is that why on paper a lot of this focus was on small and medium enterprises. Reforms policies were not exactly designed to address firms in the informal sector. And the other element is that a lot of the measures prescribed involves tax measures that were meant to benefit firms in the short term. So, for instance, tax exemptions. But there wasn't an approach to these tax reforms that meant pushing the country towards more progressive tax structure. Third area, the promotion of market-driven reforms of public utilities, often through the use of public-private partnerships. Again, we are talking about pandemic period in which there was a lot of prescription for reforming the energy sector by liberalizing the sector, by prescribing reforms in the tariff structure, by asking governments to compensate public utilities for their losses that were happening because poor consumers, poor users were not asked to actually pay their bills during the crisis, during the pandemic. Finally, well, not finally, but next area is social protection. Again, obviously, a lot of emphasis on social protection measures has to be expected, has to be hoped for, and a lot actually of very positive emphasis on social protection measures. The point here is that on one side, there is still reliance on targeting, and seeing targeting as the best way of delivering social protections no matter what. And also the fact that a lot of these reforms somehow underscore the inadequacy of the social protection systems that existed in a lot of countries that therefore needed very rapid and probably fiscally unsustainable scaling up in the very short term. Luis, how am I going with time?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. So I think I've missed, this is my last slide. You will see that if you look in the report, there is detailed analysis of this policy of prior actions, conditionalities in these 7 policy areas. And overall, what comes out, the picture that comes out is that definitely these past 2 years have not been used by the World Bank to push something new, but if anything, to reinforce its policy blueprint and vision of development onto countries. And the use of conditionality is key in doing this. And I just want to throw a few ideas that, again, they are in the report, but why the use of conditionality is still so controversial today. And of course, and including in an instrument like budget support, which theoretically is the best form of support that we would want to see international institutions to get onto countries. And the problem is that this is still
You have less than a minute now, Chiara.
Less than a minute. Okay, I'm done anyway. It's just to say that this is still a major instrument of undue influence from the World Bank on countries' policy space, because it's, despite the dialectic that for sure is there between governments and the bank when it comes to specific policy changes, there is still power relations that sees the World Bank being the one with the money in its pockets and the government being the one to have to implement the requested change. There is then another big issue, which I think hopefully are going to discuss later, which is the role that conditionality can play in bringing about change when it comes to climate action and fight against corruption. And of course, it is to be debated the extent to which this can be achieved through conditionality. I'll stop here. I think I've exhausted my time.
Yes, you have, exactly on time. Thanks. So yeah, thanks for that, Chiara. You bring out some very interesting points, obviously. And apropos of the first bullet point, I think that's one of the key issues of discussion, right? We are arguing basically that the World Bank and IMF blueprint is not the best blueprint for development. They would argue to the contrary. I think, for example, it's interesting to note Mark Varsbrot at CEPR in DC, he published some research years ago now, showing that the bulk of poverty eradication in the world since 1980s has been the consequence of Chinese growth and they argue and that they have done that precisely by skewing the consensus, the Washington consensus, right, imposed by the Bretton Woods institutions. So I think that's a very interesting topic to think about, and maybe Alex will shed some light on the developmental impacts of their policies and the opposition to state-led development. Alex, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot. And I think what I have to say kind of follows on some of the themes that Don and Chiara mentioned in their presentations. And I'll talk more about the IMF and then reflect a little bit about the World Bank-IMF relationship later on. But maybe building on something that Dawn was presenting, what this figure that you see on your screens show is the total number of conditions that countries around the world have had to implement over the last 40 years. So you see that some regions, especially West Africa and Eastern Europe, stand out for having had to implement a very, very high number of conditions, which of course have really long-term implications. So this is the cumulative number of conditions. And of course, some countries that you see have had fewer programs, like China, you see, has had few conditions, but China had only a couple of programs in the early 1980s. Whereas other countries, you see Pakistan, Argentina have had many, many programs that have several reform conditions attached to them. Now, what I want to say on this graph is that these conditions matter in the long run. So it's not that the IMF imposes some conditions that have this contemporaneous effect on the country, which they certainly do, but they also have very long-term effects in the type of development models that countries can pursue. Notoriously, you can only privatize natural resources or state-owned enterprises once, because once you do that, it's very, very difficult to roll back those measures and renationalize state-owned enterprises or natural resources. Ecuador tried to do it, and they faced tremendous pushback, and so have many other countries who have tried, not to even mention how the world trading regime reinforces these policies that were included through structural adjustment programs. And here what I have in mind is the so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which of course provide the opportunity to investors, so to major multinational companies, to sue countries for introducing policies that threaten the profitability of those investments. So this is a little bit of the historical picture, but what this graph does is basically it shows the same thing, the total number of conditions that countries have had to implement over the last decade. And here again, you see that West Africa stands out, as well as many countries in Central Africa, and of course, Eastern Europe, Greece, Bosnia as well. So the reason I put this figure on is to make the point that the nature of the IMF has changed to some degree in terms of who are its main borrowers. So it used to be the case that many middle-income countries turned to the IMF, and that is not really the case anymore, or at least not the upper middle-income countries. So the IMF has been increasingly lending to low-income countries over the last 10 years, which reflects this deep desire of many middle-income countries exactly to escape the kind of conditionalities that Don mentioned in his presentation. So what they did is, to a large degree, they build up their international reserves in order to have buffers and avoid reaching the doors of the IMF asking for a loan until it was absolutely necessary. And of course, building up international reserves is not a distributionally neutral thing to do. It is money that could be spent on a range of other things. So with this in mind, what I want to introduce now is a distinction in the types of conditions that are included in IMF programs. So one big chunk of conditions, which I will call core policy conditions, are conditions that target macroeconomic indicators, are things like fixing, addressing, changing the budget deficit, or changing international reserves, debt levels, and so on. And I'll come back to those conditions in a moment. But then there is the second set of conditions, which I have alluded to, which are the so-called structural reforms. And what this figure shows is the percentage of IMF programs with at least one condition in the different policy areas. So what you see is that basically structural reforms, by which I mean state-owned enterprise reforms, labor issues, reforms to labor codes and labor standards, and more broadly institutional reforms, are still alive and very much included in IMF programs, not to the degree that they were included in the peak of the Washington Consensus and 1990s or the early 2000s, but they are still very, very much included. You see, for example, that more than half, almost 60% of IMF programs include conditions to reform state-owned enterprises, usually privatize them or deregulate, liberalize, and so on. A range of institutional reforms that affect how public administrations are organized, as well as labor reforms that are mandated. Now, some of you may recall that the IMF had this very controversial set of reforms on limiting public sector wage bills, so the amount that the public sector could spend on wages. They discontinued that policy over I think in 2007 or so, but as we will see later, still these reforms pop up in IMF programs, although arguably a bit less than they did in the past. And what the orange line shows, and maybe that's something we can discuss later on in conjunction with what Kara mentioned about green conditionalities, or the likelihood of green conditionalities, is that the IMF includes now in many of its programs so-called poverty reduction policies. Now, what that means is a floor on social expenditures, and especially on health and education. So, and that is what in the IMF's view is putting a human face into the economic reforms that countries have to undertake. Now, more often than not, this is controversial, because even so, this nominally positive step that the IMF has taken actually reflects a very different vision for social protection than the vision included in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is generally a vision that favors targeting very vulnerable populations rather than building up the universal social protection systems that the Sustainable Development Goals, the International Labour Organization, as well as the World Health Organization have been talking about. Now, there are these long-standing criticisms on the impact of these institutions, and I will not go at length on this, but it's highly questionable whether they help. IMF conditionalities have helped economic performance in the long run, especially for middle-income countries. They constrain, as we discussed, both in the short and the medium run, the policy space that countries have, so the autonomy they have in order to implement different developmental policies that they may consider appropriate, as well as, of course, having very real social consequences. Sometimes these consequences are direct, so cuts to the health sector, that was a common thing, especially in the past, would mean that hospitals could no longer, or health centers could no longer deal with demand for their services. But very often they are indirect effects. So these programs include, increase poverty or increase unemployment, which then has follow-on implications on a range of social indicators, including well-being, including health, including access to education, and so on. So with this in mind, kind of what does the situation look like since the onset of COVID? So there's been this large expansion of IMF lending. About $120 billion have been given by the IMF since the onset of the pandemic. And what this rather complicated figure shows is the distribution of that lending between lending instruments that have conditionalities and instruments that don't. So what I would like to draw your attention on is kind of from the right-hand side, the third box, you see a big chunk of money, $55 billion that went to 4 countries. That is actually misleading because it was a precautionary loan that went to Chile, Panama, a couple of other Latin American countries that was never drawn on. So countries had the option to draw on it.
Alex, you have a minute, just so
I have a minute. But basically the bulk of the other funding was channeled through instruments that had conditionalities attached. So these are kind of the red boxes where we see that about 31 countries have borrowed with conditionalities attached, even in the midst of COVID. Now, what do these programs look like? I'm not going to go in depth with it, but we see from Ecuador massive fiscal adjustments that include cuts to public sector spending on wages, pensions, fuel subsidies. Kenya also has to reform state-owned enterprises, reduce the wage bill, and so on. And maybe what I want to end with is to look at the projections of the IMF for fiscal spending. So these are the projections of the IMF for fiscal spending into the near future. And what this graph measures is the difference between what the IMF projects countries should spend in 2023 versus the average of what they spent over the 2010s. So to get an idea of whether there is austerity or not. And what you see is that basically in many parts of the world, especially middle-income countries, there will be large amounts of austerity coming. And in this context, again, it will be the IMF and the World Bank that will have a central role in managing how this austerity falls on the population. So the distributional implications as well as the environmental and social implications. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. It's very useful. Just a couple of comments to pick up on a couple of threads, maybe to help along the discussion later. You know, the Alex question, he brought up the economic performance of conditionalities. And it's quite interesting to think about the parameters by which those are measured also, right? How do we measure economic performance? And should we rather not perhaps look at human development measurements rather than economic development models, right? And we know that the bank and the fund don't conduct any ex-ante human rights assessment of their policy conditions, for example. It's something to think about. So with that in mind, I'll now turn the floor over to our last presenter, Wangari. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Luis. I don't have a presentation. I will just speak from the heart, so to speak. You know, the quote at the beginning of the report that Chiara took us through, that Eurodad published in September, you know, from David Malpass, really caught my attention, because he's basically saying that countries will need to implement structural reforms and deal with, you know, excessive regulation, subsidies, licensing regimes, trade protection or litigiousness. And although we're now sort of used to hearing this kind of language from the World Bank and others, this kind of language is still unbelievable to me, crass even, you know, if we can sort of describe it that way, considering what we know to be the effects of deregulation, removal of subsidies, and removal of trade protections and so on. And as Chiara points out in her paper, the World Bank seems to have a clear objective to use the COVID crisis to push its policy blueprint, a blueprint that we know and Kiara, Alex, and Dawn have all spoken to, some of the harmful, the ways that blueprint is harmful in many ways. So in a short while, I will make, I'll focus my comments a bit on the impact of conditionality more generally, particularly on women, and focus the situation in Africa. But for some reason, in putting together my thoughts, I found myself focusing on healthcare, probably because we continue to be in the middle of a health pandemic, and although we know that its impacts go far beyond health. But I wanted to start with this. In August this year, there was the African Conference on Debt and Development, out of which came the Harare Declaration. And I think the sort of clarion call behind the declaration is that Africa must move from being a rule taker to being a rule maker. And this is recognizing that many countries on the continent, and indeed the rest of the global south, were already classified as facing debt crises before the pandemic, and that the nature of this debt has been further complicated by the pandemic. Against a new landscape that poses even greater risks. And that landscape, of course, includes development policy financing and its accompanying so-called prior actions, which Kiara has spoken to. I think one of the things I want to respond, rather add on to some of the issues you opened with, Louis, at the beginning of this session, around the question of corruption. I think it can be, it's been said, and it has been said, it indeed continues to be said, that perhaps the biggest success of the structural adjustment programs of the 90s and the early 2000s was to convince us that African states are incapable of shaping and implementing sound economic and social policy without outside help or guidance. This is something that scholars have referred to as the African failure complex. And it seems to have lasting widespread acceptance, both in and outside of the continent. So it shows up in phrases and ideas, for example, corruption being endemic to Africa. Is corruption a serious problem in Africa? Yes, most certainly. However, it's not unique nor endemic to Africa. Should it be addressed? Yes. But as you alluded to earlier, Louis, we have to have a more nuanced and balanced view of the interplay of internal and external factors, including the massive problem of illicit financial flows out of the continent. UNCTAD has reported that stopping illicit capital flight could almost cut in half Africa's annual financing gap of $200 billion. This is the financing gap that we have to achieve the SDGs, and also estimating that 88.6 billion US dollars, which is equivalent to 3.7% of Africa's GDP, leaves the continent as illicit capital flight, and that is nearly as much as the combined annual inflows of official development assistance and yearly foreign direct investment. So if we're to talk about corruption, we have to look at the widely reported widespread ethical misconduct and conflict of interest in the World Bank's own practices and products, including the Doing Business report. It has been recorded that in the 1990s, when African economists rejected structural adjustment, donors even ghost wrote reports, pretending that they were written locally and then praising them for their thoughtful insights. In some countries, whole ministries were even partitioned among different donors. And the effect of this was that there was little room for African states to define and chart their own policy agenda. At the onset of the debt crisis in the 80s, the policies of many African countries were decided by donors and creditors. I think that's, including the IMF and the World Bank. And I think that's something that we've probably heard before. And I would urge those of us who haven't to find some time to read a paper, Our Continent, Our Future, African Perspectives on Structural Adjustment by the late Tandika Mkandawire and Charles Soludo, whereas these are recorded in detail. That paper was written almost 20 years ago, but it's amazing to see how some of that analysis applies today. In fact, we cannot say that the situation in the present is any different. A friend of mine, Crystal Signoni, who founded the NAWI AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective, and I did a case study last year on medical equipment leasing in Kenyan public health, in the Kenyan public health system, and the connections with neo-colonial global finance. This is going to be published soon by Dawn. Dawn is Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, alongside similar case studies from other countries in the South. And this is part of their wider analysis of the impact of PPPs, public-private partnerships on women's human rights. Anyway, in the paper, we remark that when it comes to PPP architecture in Kenya, because our case study was on Kenya, it's really difficult to see where the government starts and where the World Bank ends. And more importantly, where the space for public participation is. I'm saying all this for a reason. It speaks to the section in the report on conditionality that Kiara took us through on undue influence over policymaking and undermining of countries' policy space and democratic ownership. I would add that economic policy conditionalities like fiscal consolidation and its close relative, I guess we could call it, privatization, these force governments to do the least precisely when they are needed to do the most. And we also need to keep resurfacing the neo-colonial root of this. A major driver of financialization is the G20, with the G7 controlling the IMF and many multilateral development banks. Something the economic anthropologist Jason Hickel describes as a global apartheid in the global governance system, with an obscene imbalance of decision-making power in favor of rich global North countries and, of course, private finance. How much longer, Luis?
Sorry, I'm unmuting. You have 3.5 minutes.
All right, so back to the Eurodad report. In the analysis of prior actions, we see that very few prior actions cover improvement of access to health services by removing financial barriers. A study by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation from about 7 years ago found that 9 countries in Africa had out-of-pocket health expenditures, as a percentage of total health expenditures of between 50.8 to 75.5%. So that's against the global average at that time of 18.8%. Women's out-of-pocket expenditure has been found to be systematically higher than that of men, at least in part because of the high financial burden related to paying for delivery care and other reproductive services. So this, I think, is quite widely documented. But beyond that, for women, this is not only a question of our own health. Failing or failed, collapsed healthcare systems mean more hours and energy caring for ill children and other family members, and less time and energy available for other activities and pursuits, including decent paid work or leisure or education or seeking public office and so on. In August of last year, we surveyed just over 1,200 young women in urban informal settlements in Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and India. The survey was on the impact so far of COVID on their lives and livelihoods. And between 60 to 88% of them reported an increase in household work combined with reduced access to public services. And the reality is that we know that the public services they're referring to are not really public in the strict sense. There are user fees applied. But the point is that the fact is that women's unpaid and underpaid labor subsidizes collapsed public health systems and other public services, of course. 70% of the health and social care workforce are women, and 1 in 5 women are employed in the care sector. National and local healthcare delivery are therefore not only a matter of health outcomes, but of paid and unpaid labor, livelihoods, and the full body of human rights. I'm not going to talk too much about health workers. Alex spoke a little bit about the issue of public sector wage bill containment or constraints. I just wanted to point out that ActionAid with Public Services International and Education International released a report last month on this. It's called The Public versus Austerity.
You now have a minute, sorry, just to let you know.
Yeah, I can pop the link to that report below. But the one thing I do want to say as I try and close really quickly is that, you know, the sort of narrative around what I was calling the African, you know, failure complex also extends to public sector workers. So you have a situation where public sector workers are on the receiving end of a backlash that doesn't often reflect wider structural failings, you know, and doesn't pay attention to individual and collective labor rights as workers. In closing, I just want to stress one particular aspect, sort of reflecting on the recommendations from the report, which is the issue around public oversight and citizen participation. As I was going to give examples, I won't be able to do that now. But what I want to say is that as a strong believer in the potential of massive and cross-movement social organizing and the urgent need for increased horizontality in public decision-making, but more broadly, indeed, in the redistribution of power and resources, I think we urgently need to call for, you know, we urgently need to step up public political education on these matters. I wish I had a chance to give the examples I wanted to give from Kenya. But we do need to package the information in a way that will support this and invest in massive initiatives that return power to the people. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have one respondent, Matthew Martin, and I'll give him the floor in a second. But I just wanted to say, you know, I think it's quite important, the issue that Wangari noted around the governance of both principal institutions, the World Bank and IMF, which we know have famously undemocratic and unrepresentative governance structures. So one wonders, is not too much of a step to take a link between the types of policies that are conditioned and the governing structure. But also, you know, I like to just take, in terms of putting the context, historical context, the 1974 New Economic Order Declaration, the General Assembly in the United Nations, states that the Global South calls for the extension of active assistance to developing countries by the whole international community, free of any political or military conditions. And then the other thing that I find quite interesting is giving the developing countries access to the achievements of modern science and technology and promotion of the transfer of technology and the creation of indigenous technology for the benefit of the developing countries in the form and in accordance with procedures that are suited to their economies. I raise that because I wonder, you know, to what extent the conditions that are tied to the current programs of the IMF and the World Bank, among other DFIs, really support this type of indigenous development. So with that in mind, I'll give the floor over to Matthew. I believe you're there with us and you like to speak. Thanks.
Yes, I am. Thanks very much, Luis. Can you just tell me how long I've got, just so I can cut it as necessary? For you, 5 minutes. Great, thanks. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, it's great to see many of you again, but for those of you who don't know me, I've had a 30-year association with Eurodad and its regional partners, including, I think, my best achievement with you all was helping Eurodad get access to the first ever detailed loan-by-loan creditor database back in the 1990s, which helped tremendously with activism on the Paris Club and other creditors and the previous round of debt relief. In my day job, I support developing country governments and all the different stakeholders, including above all CSOs, and building their capacity and helping them fight their corner with these organizations. And I've spent 35 years also analyzing the Bretton Woods institutions' conditionality. And I really liked Wangari's starting point, which was speaking from the heart, because I'm speaking very much from the heart in what I do now, which is principally to be fighting against what I would call the inequality emergency in the world, which is just as bad as the climate emergency, frankly, but maybe people don't want to talk about it quite as much. So I would really love to engage on the lessons of 30 years and the structure of the international system, and but I above all want to focus down on what is most useful, I think, which is what's the current situation and where might it be going in future, why it exists, which I'll start with, and then finally a little bit on how to change it. And I hope I won't sound, compared with some of my predecessors, like I'm defending the
Matthew, you seem to have dropped off.
Yeah, I think Joe is trying to make him a panelist, so there he is, so he can go on camera. Wonderful. But Matthew, you are on mute.
Yeah, Matthew, you're on mute.
Yes, fine, thank you. So yes, I was just saying, I hope I won't sound like I'm defending the institutions concerned. I'm definitely not. And my view is just, if they have to continue to exist, which many of us think they shouldn't, how can we push them to help rather than hindering global development? So let me start with why there's conditionality. And I think it's really important to realize that this is not some issue which is fundamentally propelled by the management and staff of the institutions concerned. The real driver is the OECD government shareholders of these organizations, who believe, and it's written into the constitution of both organizations, that conditionality is essential to ensuring the institutions get repaid. We may all totally disagree with that, but it's there and we're stuck with it. So that also then means that conditionality is very often driven by the policy and government changes in key OECD countries with a bit of a time lag. And you can see some fairly, I think, distinctive phases if you look at it with a bit of hindsight. So you can think hardline neoliberalism in the late 80s and 90s. You can think neoliberalism with poverty reduction tacked on in the decade of the 2000s. You can think slightly less neoliberalism with inequality and poverty, or that horrible formulation of the World Bank shared prosperity, tacked on in the last decade. And now I think coming in very strongly, those things plus a big new focus on transparency and anti-corruption. And, you know, one other example of that, which to me spoke volumes, which I was involved in, was the doing business anti-labor criterion getting taken out essentially of that whole process by the Democratic US Congress, even though it was the time of the Bush administration. So it just shows how strongly the US administration influences these things. None of this, of course, is to excuse the institutions themselves. Within that mandate, managing directors, presidents have a considerable margin to set priorities. I think Christine Lagarde, Kristalina Georgieva, Jim Wolfenson have tried to do that in a somewhat more progressive way. Many others have frankly just sat on their backsides and continued to implement most of what their predecessors left them, no matter how bad it was. And that, I think, has less to do with their ideology and more to do with their lack of managerial experience or competence. And below them, the management and staff have the right to change the details of it and the operational guidelines, and often they don't do so. And that's often what we end up fighting about in the civil society policy forums in Washington. Why have your leaders said these wonderful things and then you're not doing anything about them?
Sorry, Matthew, you just have about a minute left. Sorry, just
that's fine. I'm nearly there. So I think we need to force them to be the best they can be. What are the types of conditions then? Most has been said. There are policy, project and procedural conditions which insist on still mainly neoliberal policies and delay disbursements. So we need to fight for much less conditionality. We also need to fight for coherence, especially in the World Bank, because you have a kind of rogue IFC being much more neoliberal than many other people in the World Bank. We need to acknowledge that it varies among borrowers. So there's an acknowledgement that poverty and inequality should be important in poor countries, but not in middle-income countries. And therefore, the conditionality is much worse in middle-income countries. What's changing now? Well, slightly positively, I think there are a few more green shoots of anti-inequality policies on the IMF side, and probably none that I've seen in the World Bank side since COVID. What's probably negative, but I'm not sure, and maybe something we want to discuss, is this new focus on transparency, even on SDRs and emergency loans, which are not supposed to have many conditions at all. Is that good or is that bad from a CSO point of view? Absolutely austerity, and it's something we and Oxfam in our commitment to reducing inequality reports are shouting loudly about. But we need to realize that the way out of austerity lies partly in IMF frameworks, but partly in creating the fiscal space through other measures like aid, debt relief, and tax reform. I'm very glad Eurodad is having sessions on joining that all up. And then there's the potentially very negative, but coming along the tracks rapidly, which is a huge land grab by both institutions to do climate conditionality. And I think we need to get our act together as a community to know what we even want to say about that. You know, maybe we want to say it should all be done by the UN, but then we also want to, as we have had to do in the past, acknowledge that a lot of it will be done by them and work out how to engage with them. And finally, one last word, which I said at a previous Eurodad conference: if we want to change the way these organizations work, we need above all to influence our own governments and the policy dialogue in our own countries. And I mean that north and south. I think, speaking as an African by origin and birth, I think the Africa Rising narrative by neoliberal leaders of Africa was just as bad as anything coming from the north. And we need to make sure that it's replaced by the Africans Rising narrative by people like Kumi Naidoo, i.e. the people asserting their rights and having that, not just think that we can move from north to south and everything will be fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. So now I'd like to open up the floor. I know there's at least one question. Before doing so, I'll just make one other comment that maybe can stimulate some questions or comments from the panel. Is, I would argue that there's also been a change in the conditions derived from the fact that the liberalization of capital conditions initially in the structural adjustment programs has such an impact in global economic order and functioning that those have in a way transformed the conditions that are necessary to reproduce the system. Anyway, so I know that we have at least one question, and I'm going to try to scroll. Where is it? The question, which says, very interesting that both, very interesting that both Alex and Chiara mentioned poverty targeting as policy conditions. I'd like to follow that up. Ganel from ACTA Church, Sweden. Does she have this ability to speak?
I think Gunnel has left.
Oh.
But she had also left an interesting, another interesting question in the Q&A box, where she was mentioning the fact that indeed the IMF rhetoric now is very much against austerity. When we go to speak to EDs, they say that they always put these social protection safeguards in the programs, as Alex was mentioning earlier. When we go to them saying, well, actually countries are implementing austerity measures, and they come back saying, oh, but that has been negotiated with the governments, it's something that may come from governments themselves. And indeed, we do experience this tension a lot. Wangari is saying she has lost sound. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Okay,
yeah.
Then. So yeah, and I have a brief comment, but I would actually see if there are other questions first.
Well, why don't we do, because otherwise I think that, can we do one question at a time? Because otherwise I feel like some questions are left, or would you want to take a couple questions? There's Rick Rowden has a question for Alex also. Alex, can you see the question? Cuts in public spending and the wage bill ceilings often get a lot of attention, but could you talk about public investment as a percentage of GDP and the link between tight IMF policies and the constraints these place on the ability of government to scale up public investment and the long-term developmental impact of this has on the ability of countries to build up and expand capital expenditure?
Yeah, okay, this is a great point. And, under IMF programs, austerity programs, there is, public disinvestment, if we could say it like that. So, of course, public investment plummets. And to the extent that money is supposed to be available for capital expenditures, as Rick mentions, health, education, transportation, and so on, that is often seen as money that can be secured from development partners of the countries, including the World Bank, ideally with some kind of blended finance mechanism that brings in the private sector. So Daniela Gabor from the University of Bristol has a nice concept, which I'm sure Rick knows about around the Wall Street consensus on this interlocks between basically multilateral development banks, especially the World Bank, and private sector financial actors who come in and provide the financing for these things. Of course, this creates, as I alluded to earlier, this creates these very adverse long-run implications, political economic implications, where domestic resource mobilization is very low, and it remains low because often the capacity to raise resources domestically is never really built up. All of the capacities on resource mobilization goes towards easy to administer things like increasing the VAT, but that have highly regressive distributional implications, and not really doing the kind of supporting the buildup of infrastructures that can raise money in more just and equitable terms. So there's definitely a link, and thanks for the question. And I'll stop there so we have.
What about, we still have Gamel's question unanswered around the fact that, the fund says, oh no, these are things are jointly agreed, and people, governments are happy to implement the conditions as agreed.
I can comment on that, but also happy for others to fill in. And I think that there are two issues there. I think that, of course, I think it's true, and it's true also for the World Bank, that there is a dialectic there, and that there is a tension, and that some of the reforms that are brought by these institutions sometimes are more progressive than what may come from governments themselves. I think we have seen it in several circumstances, but that's kind of not the point, because the point is that this is still the outcome of a power relation, to use old words, in which you have a global institution with its power and legitimacy that come to a government and enter in a kind of binding relationship, which is, as Wangari was reminding us earlier, it's the outcome of colonial and post-colonial relationship, and that hasn't really changed at all. And so until the governance of these institutions remain so unequal, then the relationship that they have with countries remain unfair and unequal. And the other aspect, I would say that, yes, of course, it's better that IMF recommends countries to implement safeguards to social spending. That's kind of the very least that you would expect. That's not something to be celebrated so much. It's the least that they should do. The problem is that if these safeguards anyway come in a context in which other type of policies and economic context are promoted. So if you are Ghana and you still have to access the financial markets, and that access is determined by credit rating agency, what they say, and what credit rating agency is determined by your fiscal deficits and your total debt, then frankly, you can put as many safeguards as you want, but Ghana will probably still have to cut its budget and push for that. And also similarly, if after how many years now, 20, 30, 40 years of neoliberal policies, you have economies that run around that model, it's not, you can't be surprised if it's the government itself that says, actually, I need to cut here because I don't have the fiscal space, and I can't have that easily and in a progressive way. And it's the fact is that we always need to remember the story and the global and the general context. And the last point is that the way to change this would be to have much greater engagement with local civil society for these institutions. So be way more uncomfortable than they are in doing their job, in speaking with finance ministers and governments, and actually, get the sweat and the blood and the dirt in negotiating reforms.
Thanks. I'll just add that I think, there's a post-colonial and there's a hierarchy of the international architecture, but there's also the very present divergence of power, right? You have one country that countries only go to the IMF when they absolutely feel as though they have no alternative. So it's not as if you're engaged in an equally balanced negotiation among equal parties, right? So I think, yes, the IMF can say, yes, everyone has happily agreed. Well, under what power differentials, right? I think that's a key question. I don't know if there are any other, are there other questions? I know there was a statement. Are there any final, I know we're also running out of time, but I don't know if there are any final questions from anyone. If they're not, then I don't know, we don't have enough time to go around the table again and have final comments, I don't think, unless we can overrun a bit, which I'm happy to do, but I'm not organizing this. So Chiara, do you want to allow people?
I'll see if Don and Wangari want to add something. I think I've made my final remark. I don't need to add anything more.
So maybe can we give the floor first to Don and then Wangari, and then we'll for final thoughts and comments, and then we'll close. Thanks.
Yeah. There was one question actually about that there will be no austerity from IMF, and this also related to the concept of ownership that both World Bank and IMF already always say that policies should be owned by the country. But in fact, it's actually even ownership is a conditionality also. Like for example, in policy-based lending, which is categorized as prior action, for example, the policy reforms are made by the countries, first by the government, and then it is evaluated by the World Bank. And if it satisfies the World Bank, then they sign the loan agreement. And it happens, and then because of this procedure, then the World Bank said, yeah, it is owned by the country. Because it is already started by country. But actually, in fact, when this is the policies are designed and implemented, and it comes to become a law in the country, it was actually the World Bank's experts who are doing this, or they hire international experts or the international companies to write the policies, and then gave it to the government. The government said, okay, it works for us, and then present it to the World Bank, and World Bank said, okay, then we sign the loan agreement. So it happens actually in Indonesia. So it seems that all policies are owned by Indonesian government or Indonesia, but in fact, actually, it is actually supplanted by the World Bank to make sure that the government have to take these policies, make these policies in order to get the loan from the government. So I think the austerity is also working like that. But the other thing about austerity, because the developing countries now have more alternative for source of funds. If IMF put austerity, then they can go to China or to India to get funds for supporting the country. So there are more alternatives for the developing country now, rather than going to the institution that put austerity conditions to the countries. Yeah.
Thanks, Don. I don't know. Wangari seems to have lost sound. I don't know if she can contribute or. So keep in mind that I think we're out of time, and with apologies for Wangari, which I don't know what the technical issues have been. Maybe Chiara, would you like to make any parting words as we close?
No, I just want to thank everyone for coming and for staying. I know we have run a little bit late, and also our speakers. I feel that it's a conversation that needs to be continued. I feel we're still only scratching the issue, so hopefully we will have other opportunities opportunities to continue this formally or informally. But yes, again, thanks everyone. I think the recordings will be available soon. We will be sharing them, and also thanks everyone who is in the background and is making all these events possible. Thanks Joe and Ilaria and the comms team. All right, well, have a good rest of the day, everyone, and stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chiara, again, and Eurodad for organizing. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Alex. Goodbye, Chiara.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. I will send you an email shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Okay.
Bye.